Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-priced commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at the power-hungry ogre turned all-consuming demon, Hidetsugu Devouring Chaos. Before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description to keep me caffeinated as I continue to work on more of these builds. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see who won last week's poll and what commanders from Neon Dynasty you'll be voting for an upcoming episode. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Hidetsugu Devouring Chaos is a 4/4 ogre demon that costs 3 and a black with the following abilities. Pay a black and sack a creature to scry 2. Pay 2 a red and tap it, exile a top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. When you exile a non-land card this way, Hidetsugu Devouring Chaos deals damage equal to the exiled card's mana value to any target. Taking a look at his core stats, Hidetsugu possesses a mid-size CMC and a stat block to match, alongside an on-demand sack outlet that allows him to set up the top of our deck, and then the means to impulse draw those cards while tacking on some damage-based removal or burn as we do so. Going more in-depth into his first ability, it provides us with a cheap and repeatable sack outlet that gives us a fair bit of card selection with its scry 2. While it may not be free, the fact that it lets us go 2 cards deep into our deck is quite relevant, especially if we have draw triggers or are doing so on our opponent's turns, to ensure the top card of our deck is the one we want to be there before or after our draw. This then works nicely with his second ability, which allows us to impulse draw the top card of our deck and add some sizable damage that scales with its CMC. And while 3 mana is a bit steep for effectively a draw 1, the fact that it can damage anything and that we're under no obligation to cast that spell means we can easily just use it for removal or to hit face, which is perfectly viable if we're setting up some high CMC targets on top of our deck for it to hit. So as we can see, this version of Hidetsugu is a sack outlet that cares about setting up our top deck and then using those cards as burn or removal, which is why we'll be taking this build in an Aristocrats focused direction that aims to get the most bang for our buck out of our commander's ability by enabling him to hit massive spells to take huge chunks out of our opponent's life totals. Of course, that means we'll be needing to run a decent amount of high CMC spells for our commander to hit, but to ensure that we can still cast these spells after our commander reveals them instead of just using them for removal or burn, the vast majority of them will have alternate casting costs or ways to reduce their costs, allowing us to have our cake and eat it too by abusing the card's high base CMC for the damage, and then casting it at a reduced cost to get the effect or body on board as well. But before we can begin throwing our top deck at our opponent's faces, we'll need to make sure we have the means to stack the deck in our favor. That of course means we'll be running plenty of ways to stack the top of our deck, and creatures that are able to reanimate or recur themselves to be sacked by our commander for the scry. And in the latter's case, we'll also be running means to get them directly into our grave from our deck or hand to be used as quickly as possible, as well as plenty of payoffs to take advantage of our creatures being sacrificed over and over again by turning them into value in the form of card advantage or ramp, and even additional damage to work alongside our commander. And finally, it won't just be our commander who's taking advantage of our top deck, as we'll be running plenty of other effects that will weaponize it to get even more damage in, enabling us to continue getting damage in even if our commander's dealt with, or working alongside him to burn our opponents down even faster. But enough talk, as Hidetsugu has waited long enough. The seals that Kyodai used to imprison him in the spirit realm have finally failed, and after 1200 years, the most powerful demon on Kamigawa is free once more. Now leading his army of fanatical demonic cultists, Hidetsugu aims to bring chaos and destruction onto Kamigawa unlike anything ever seen before, returning it back to the primordial chaos from which it emerged and devouring it as his old master failed to do over a millennia ago. But unlike his master, this time there'll be no one left to stop him. So now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Starting off in the CMC 1 slot, we have a pair of self-reanimating creatures with Bloodsoaked Champion and Persistent Specimen, both of which are able to return themselves back onto the field from the grave, the former being a 2/1 that can't block and can do so by paying 1 and a black if a creature attacked that turn, and the latter being a 1/1 that can do so by paying 2 and a black and comes into play tapped, both serving as cheap bodies to get on board early and get value out of all game long as we sack them and recur them over and over again. Impulsive Pilferer then closes out this slot, a 1/1 that creates a treasure when it dies and has Encore for 3 and a red, making it a decent sacrifice target early for the ramp and getting us even more ramp later with its Encore to facilitate casting our higher CMC spells. The CMC 2 slot then brings us some more self-reanimating entrants with Reassembling Skeleton and Nether Trader, both of which return themselves back to the fields from the graveyard, the former being a 1/1 that costs 1 and a black to do this and comes back into play tapped, and the latter also being a 1/1, this time with Shadow and Haste, that costs only a black to do this but only if a creature entered our graveyard from the field that turn, again giving us more cheap recurable bodies for our commander to sack away to stack our deck and trigger any death payoffs we may have on board. Death payoffs like Blood Artist and Zulaport Cutthroat, both of which drain our opponents as creatures die, the former being a 0/1 that has target opponent lose a life and has us gain a life whenever any creature dies, while the latter is a 1/1 that has each opponent lose a life as we gain a life instead, but only when a creature we control dies, making them both decent ways to pile on the damage as we sack our self-reanimating creatures and even pad our life totals in the process. Then we close out this slot with Keen Duelist, a 2/2 that, on our upkeep, has both us and target opponent reveal a top card of our decks and has each player lose life equal to the CMC of the card revealed by their opponent, effectively serving as a manaless way to take advantage of our high CMC spells for some extra burn and getting us some card advantage as a bonus. Moving on to the CMC 3 slot, we start off with a trio of black sack payoffs in the form of Pawn of Ulamog, Grim Haruspex, and Morbid Opportunist. Pawn of Ulamog is a 2/2 that creates a 0/1 token when it or another non-token creature we control dies, which we can sack to generate a colorless mana, both providing us with sack fodder to enable our commander's scry, as well as additional ramp to help cast our higher CMC spells as needed. Grim Haruspex and Morbid Opportunist both draw us cards as creatures die, the first being a 3/2 with more for a black that does so only as non-token creatures we control die, and the second being a 1/3 that draws a card whenever any creature dies but is limited to once per turn, both serving as solid sources of card advantage that fit our sack-heavy playstyle. Then we have some treasure-focused payoffs joining our ranks with Undercity Scrounger and Gadrick the Crown Scourge. Undercity Scrounger is a 1/4 that we can tap to create a treasure, which we can only activate if a creature died that turn, easily allowing us to stockpile treasure turn after turn as we sack our creatures away or our opponents deal with each other's creatures instead. Gadrak is a 5/4 flyer that can't attack unless we control 4+ artifacts and, on our end step, creates a treasure for each non-token creature that died that turn, easily filling our coffers with mana to help fuel our higher CMC spells and serving as a decent-sized evasive body in the meantime to pile on the damage. Judith the Scourge Diva then joins us as our last death payoff in this slot, being a 2/2 that gives all other creatures we control +1/+0 and, whenever a non-token creature we control dies, deals 1 damage to any target. Both her Anthem and extra damage giving the build some extra reach to help whittle down our opponent's life totals that much faster. Moving away from the sack payoffs and onto the sacrifices themselves, we're running both Scry the Immortal and Scry Goblin Nabob, the former being a 2/1 that we can cast both from our grave and from exile, and the latter being a 1/1 that returns from our grave back to our hand on our upkeep, providing us with some red-flavored reanimation and recursion to help bolster our build sacrifice targets. Then we close out this slot with Sin Prodder, a 3/2 with Menace that, on our upkeep, has us reveal a top card of our deck, letting us put it into our hand unless an opponent takes damage equal to the revealed card's CMC, giving us yet another way to weaponize our top deck by either having our opponents take extra damage or letting us get an extra card per turn, either result being fine by us. Now entering the CMC 4 slot, we have yet another trio of Death Matter payoffs joining us, with Sifter of Skulls, Falconwrath Noble, and Vindictive Vampire. Sifter of Skulls is a 4/3 with Devoid that, whenever another non-token creature we control dies, creates a 1/1 that we can sack to generate a colorless mana, providing us with another death-focused source of tokens to help us screen attacks, sack for value, or use as ramp as needed. Falconwrath Noble is a 2/2 flyer that, whenever it or another creature dies, has target opponent lose 1 life as we gain 1 life, effectively making it a bigger evasive version of Blood Artist that can get in for damage itself as it drains out our opponents. Vindictive Vampire is a 2/3 that, whenever another creature we control dies, has each opponent lose 1 life while we gain 1 life, this time being the scaled-up version of Zulaport Cutthroat that, like its smaller cousin, gives us a decent amount of AoE drain as we sack away our creatures. A pair of Rakdos legendaries then join us as we move deeper into this slot with Prosper Tomebound and Rakdos Lord of Riots. Prosper is a 1/4 with Death Touch that, on our end step, exiles a top card of our deck and lets us play it until the end of the next turn, as well as creating a treasure whenever we play any card from exile, serving as a decent source of card advantage each turn that also gets us a little extra ramp as we play the cards that both he and our other sources exile. Rakdos is a 6/6 flying trampler that can only be played if an opponent lost life that turn, and makes creature spells we cast cost 1 less for each life our opponents lost that turn, his summoning condition being easily met thanks to the host of drain effects and burn we have at our disposal, and his ability to reduce the cost of our creatures synergizing very well with our commander's burn by allowing us to cast them very cheaply after he exiles them, all while being an absolutely stacked evasive beatstick to pour on the damage himself. Then we end this slot with Violent Tumor, a 2/2 with Death Touch that, when it ETBs, has us search our deck for a creature and sends it to our graveyard, giving us an efficient way to send our best self-reanimators to the bin and leaving behind a good defensive body afterwards to help screen attacks. Moving on to the CMC 5 slot, we start off with Ingot Chewer and Shriek Maw, both of which we can evoke, the former being a 3/3 that evokes for a red and destroys target artifact when it ETBs, and the latter being a 3/2 with Fear that evokes for 1 and a black and destroys target non-black non-artifact creature when it ETBs instead, both working well alongside our commander to deal 5 damage to anything if he hits them off the top, and then allowing us to invoke them in on the cheap as additional removal and a way to proc our death payoffs. Death Tyrant then closes out this slot, a 4/5 with Menace that, whenever an attacking creature we control or a blocking creature an opponent controls dies, creates a 2/2 zombie token, and lets us pay 5 and a black to return it from our grave back onto the battlefield tapped, making it a sturdy self-reanimating threat that can easily flood our board with tokens to build up our board state or use as sack fodder. Now entering the CMC 6 slot, we have its only entrant with Chandra's Incinerator, a 6/6 trampler that can reduce its cost by X, where X is equal to the amount of non-combat damage our opponents were dealt that turn, and whenever a source we control deals non-combat damage to a player, it deals that much damage to target creature or planeswalker that player controls, usually only costing us a single red if we hit it off the top with our commander, and both serving as a powerful body and repeatable source of damage-based removal as we continue to burn out our opponents. The CMC 7 slot then brings us another single entrant with Drago the Shipwrecker, a 7/5 trampler that lets us sack any number of creatures or artifacts as we cast him, reducing his cost by 2 for each permanent that we sacked or have sacked that turn, making him another beat stick that we can play on the cheap if we've sacked creatures or treasures away that turn, while also dealing a hefty 7 damage if we hit him off the top with our commander. Nearing the end now, the CMC 8 slot starts us off with Avatar of Woe and Avatar of Fury, both of which have their cost reduced by 6 if certain conditions are met, the former being a 6/5 with Fear that gets its cost reduction if 10+ creatures are in all graveyards and we can tap to destroy target creature, and the latter being a 6/6 flyer that gets its cost reduction if an opponent controls 7+ lands and we can pay a red to give it +1/+0 until end of turn, both their cost reduction conditions being easily met in the mid to late game to deal a solid chunk of damage alongside our commander, and then allowing us to cast them on the cheap to get their huge evasive bodies on board as well. Then the latter half of this slot closes out with a pair of legendary entrants in the form of Gorex the Tomb Shell and Torgar Famine Incarnate. Gorex is a 4/4 with Death Touch that, when we cast it, lets us exile any number of creatures from our graveyard, reducing its cost by 2 for each creature exiled this way, and, when it attacks or dies, returns one of those exiled cards at random to our hand, usually being castable for double black and allowing us to get some of our previously dealt with threats back into our hand to be used again. Torgar is a 7/6 that, when we cast it, lets us sack any number of creatures to reduce its cost by 2 for each creature sacked this way, and, when it ETBs, changes target player's life total to half their starting life total rounded down. Again, usually only costing us double black thanks to the amount of sack fodder we're running, and both enabling us to bring our opponent's life totals down to size or stabilize our own as the situation calls for. Finally, reaching the CMC 9 slot and our last creature entrant, we have Necropolis Fiend, a 4/5 flyer with Delve that lets us pay X, tap it, and exile X cards from our graveyard to give target creature -X/-X until end of turn, allowing us to use our grave to delve away its massive cost and further weaponizing our grave to use as continual removal if needed. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. Starting off in the CMC 1 slot, we have its only entrant with Village Rites, which has a sack a creature to draw 2, serving as some cheap card advantage that puts to use our sack fodder outside of our commander. The CMC 2 slot then brings us its 3 entrants with Deadly Dispute, Thrill of Possibility, and Terminate. Deadly Dispute lets us sack a creature to draw 2 and create a treasure, giving us another source of sack-based card advantage and even throwing in some ramp for good measure. Thrill of Possibility lets us discard a card to draw 2, providing us with a way to dump our reanimators into our bin to bring back later, while allowing us to dig further into our deck for more resources. Terminate destroys target creature and prevents it from regenerating, making it a cheap and straightforward removal option to deal with problematic creatures at flash speed. Skipping to the CMC 4 slot, we have 2 additional removal options joining us with Baleful Mastery and Assassin's Ink, both of which we can cast for a reduced cost, the former being castable for 1 and a black if we let an opponent draw a card and exiles target creature or planeswalker, and the latter costing 1 less if we control an enchantment and 1 less if we control an artifact, destroying a creature or planeswalker instead, both letting us sting any target for 2 alongside our commander and then being castable for 2 to provide some cheap removal afterwards. Unexpected Windfall then closes out this slot, which lets us discard a card to draw 2 and create 2 treasure, again enabling us to dump our self-reanimators or dead cards into our bin to dig deeper into our deck, while also allowing us to stockpile treasure to help cast our higher CMC spells later. Finally, reaching the CMC 5 slot, we have our last entrant with Murderous Cut, which has Delve and destroys target creature, making it a great target for our commander to deal 5 damage, then castable for a single black if we have spare cards in our graveyard for the additional removal. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. Skipping to the CMC 2 slot, we start off with a pair of red entrants in the form of Tormenting Voice and Wild Guess, both of which have us discard a card to draw 2, adding additional members to our discard suite to help fill up our bin with future sacrifices and dig further into our deck while doing so. A pair of black graveyard-focused cards then closes out the latter half of this slot with Unmarked Grave and Forever Young. Unmarked Grave lets us search our deck for a non-legendary card and puts it into our graveyard, making it a cheap graveyard tutor to get our best sack targets into the bin quickly and efficiently. Forever Young returns any number of target creatures from our graveyard back to the top of our deck, then draws us a card, allowing us to recur our high CMC creatures that may have been discarded or destroyed, and giving us a cheap means to set up our commander for a large amount of damage on that or the following turns. Proceeding to the CMC 3 slot, we have its only entry with Seize the Spoils, which has us discard a card to draw 2 and creates a treasure, again providing us with more graveyard setup and treasure creation to further our game plan. Similarly, the CMC 4 slot brings us Pirate's Pillage, which again has us discard a card to draw 2 but creates 2 treasures instead, making it the bigger version of the previous entrant that lets us stockpile a bit more mana to be used for later. Continuing on to the CMC 5 slot, we have yet another single entry with Final Parting, which lets us search our deck for 2 cards, putting one into the grave and the other into our hand, making it part graveyard setup and part tutor to help us load our bin and immediately get a payoff to help us take advantage of it in one fell swoop. Then skipping all the way to the CMC 9 slot, we have a pair of board wipes being added to our arsenal with Blasphemous Act and In Garruk's Wake. Blasphemous Act costs 1 less for each creature on the battlefield and deals 13 damage to each creature, making it a powerful 1-2 punch that deals an impressive 9 damage to the face if we're able to hit it with our commander, then levels the board for usually a single mana, while also proccing all our death payoffs one final time as a parting gift. In Garruk's Wake simply destroys all creatures and planeswalkers we don't control, our high amount of treasure production and mana generation helping take the edge off its massive casting cost, and leaving us in a very favorable position once our opponent's boards are wiped clean. Finally, reaching the CMC 10 slot, we come to our last sorcery with Explosive Singularity, which lets us tap any number of untapped creatures we control to reduce its cost by 1 each and deals 10 damage to any target, potentially dealing a massive 20 damage in a single turn alongside our commander in a wide enough board state for only 2 mana, often being enough to guarantee knocking someone out in the mid to late game out of nowhere. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. Moving right into the CMC2 slot, we have its only entry with Dark Privilege, an aura that gives the enchanted creature +1/+1 and lets us sack a creature to regenerate it, serving as a cheap way to keep our commander alive through removal while sticking to our sack-focused game plan. More protection sources then join us as we enter the CMC3 slot with Blessing of Leeches and Soul Channel, both of which are auras that let us regenerate the enchanted creature, the former being castable at flash speed, costing nothing to do this but costing 1 life on our upkeep, while the latter costs 2 life to regenerate the creature instead, each providing us with manaless ways to keep Hidetsugu alive, and the life costs not being too bad since we have plenty of life drain effects to help us pay for it. Then we close out this slot with Haunted Crossroads, which lets us pay a black to put a creature from our grave back on top of our deck, making it a repeatable way to get our high CMC creatures back on top to be used by our commander again and again for some sizable burn throughout the course of the game. Skipping to the CMC 5 slot, we have its single entry with Gratuitous Violence, which doubles the amount of damage our creatures do to permanents and players, empowering our commander to hit twice as hard with his ability and expanding his and our other creatures' reach significantly to help close out games. Finally, skipping to the CMC 7 slot, we have our last enchantment with Baneful Omen, which, on our end step, lets us reveal a top card of our deck, having each opponent lose life equal to the revealed card's CMC if we do so, effectively making it an AoE version of our commander's ability that doesn't even require mana to activate each turn, which we can use alongside our commander to hit one unlucky opponent twice to really pile on the damage. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. The CMC 1 slot starts us off with Soul Ring, which taps for 2 colorless, which we run because we're not in green and it lets us get to our commander and higher CMC spells that much faster, especially if we draw it early. Brainstone then wraps up the latter half of this slot, which we can pay 2, tap it and sack it to draw 3 cards, then put 2 cards from our hand back on top of our deck, giving us a way to stack our deck with bricks we may have drawn early to convert them into damage alongside our commander on the cheap. Moving on to the CMC 2 slot, we have some mana rocks joining us, starting with Arcane Signet, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Rakdos Signet, which we can pay 1 and tap to generate both our colors, and Mind Stone, which taps for a colorless and we can pay 1 to tap it and sack it to draw a card, all 3 serving as cheap means to speed up our mana base to help us cast our higher CMC spells. Then we close out this slot in our artifacts with Swiftfoot Boots, an equipment that equips for 1 and grants the equipped creature hexproof and haste, providing us with a way to protect our commander against targeted removal, while also enabling him to use his ability immediately upon summon if we have the mana to spare. That covers all our artifacts, and since this build lacks planeswalkers, let's move straight to our land base. Starting off with our mana lands, we have Command Tower, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Dragonskull Summit, which comes into play tapped unless we control a swamp or mountain and taps for either of our colors, Smoldering Marsh, which comes into play tapped unless we control 2 or more basic lands, taps for either of our colors and counts as both a swamp and a mountain, Foreboding Ruins, which comes into play tapped unless we reveal a swamp or mountain and taps for either of our colors, Shadowblood Ridge, which we can pay 1 and tap to generate both our colors, Tainted Peak, which taps for a colorless or a black or red instead if we control a swamp, Myriad Landscape, which comes into play tapped, taps for a colorless and we can pay 2, tap it and sack it to put 2 of the same basic land from our deck into play tapped, and finally Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap and sack to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped. Then for utility lands, we'll be running Bojuka Bog, Mortuary Mire, and Witch's Cottage. Bojuka Bog comes into play tapped, taps for a black, and exiles target player's graveyard when it ETBs, giving our build a decent source of graveyard hate from the land slot to combat against other graveyard-focused builds. Mortuary Mire and Witch's Cottage both tap for a black and allow us to put a creature card from our graveyard back on top of our deck, the former coming into play tapped, while the latter comes into play tapped unless we control 3 or more swamps when it ETBs, counts itself as a swamp, and only returns a card if it comes into play untapped, making them both relatively easy ways to set up our commander's ability at no cost. Finally, we're running 12 swamps and 12 mountains as our basics to close out our land base. So, now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 34 creatures including the commander, 8 instants, 10 sorceries, 6 enchantments, 6 artifacts, 0 planeswalkers, and 36 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 13 high CMC spells with alternate casting costs, 9 cards that can set up or take advantage of our top deck, 8 sources of treasure tokens, 7 creatures capable of reanimating or recurring themselves, 6 cards that send creatures from our hand or deck to the graveyard, 3 sources of tokens, and 11 cards that care about creatures being destroyed or sacked, ensuring that the build has plenty of bodies to sack in the form of self-reanimators and tokens, plenty of cards to take advantage of their demise for value and extra damage, and plenty of high CMC cards that can either make themselves cheaper or we can pay with our treasure generation, alongside other cards that are able to get them to the top of our deck and get even further value out of them. For general deck stats, we have 15 ramp sources, 8 card draw sources, 11 targeted removal sources, and 2 board wipes. Our draw being slightly lower than normal as we'll be getting lots of value from our graveyard, but our other core stats falling within normal parameters. Looking at our mana curve, we have 7 1-drops, 16 2-drops, 13 3-drops, 11 4-drops, 6 5-drops, 1 6-drop, 2 7-drops, 4 8-drops, 3 9-drops, and 1 10-drop. Giving us a strange looking curve at first glance with a significant dip in the middle, but since so many of our high CMC spells have alternate casting costs or ways to make themselves cheaper, it's actually much smoother than it appears, allowing us to get the most damage out of our commander once he hits around the mid-game, easily allowing us to cast the high CMC spells he exiles, and reaping us further value as he sacks away our self-reanimating creatures with our Aristocrats payoffs. Currently, this deck is valued at $65, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For Sidegrades, some additional alternate casting cost cards such as Obsidian Chainmaw, Knight Incarnate, and Tombstalker could easily find a home here to give our commander even more targets to hit that we can then cast on the cheap. Jadar, Ghoulcaller of Nephalia, and Anax Hardened in the Forge both give us additional tokens that we can sack away for value. Angrat's Marauders, Insult to Injury, and Dictate of the Twin Gods warrant consideration if we're looking to double up on our commander's damage output, while Witch's Clinic and Basilisk Collar instead turn our damage into additional life gain for us so we can stay alive for longer. For upgrades, Ophiomancer provides us with a constant stream of tokens each turn for us to sack away for value. Grim Hireling enables us to stockpile even more treasure to help us cast our higher CMC spells. Furnace of Wrath and Fiery Emancipation double and triple our commander's damage output respectively with his ability, as well as increasing all our other sources of damage. And Buried Alive and Entomb help us set up our graveyard even further. And finally, if you want the best way to enable our commander's ability on the cheap, at least mana-wise, Vampiric Tutor lets us tutor up any card right to the top of our deck for only a single mana, and even has an effective reprint with Imperial Seal to double up on the top deck tutoring at nearly 16 times the price. Or alternatively, you can buy yourself a PS5 and a few games for it instead. Your call. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Taking a look at the results of last week's poll, it looks like the Goblin Samurai Goro was able to claim the top spot, so look forward to a modified build featuring him next week. Moving on to this week's poll, we'll be giving some of our silver medal winners a chance at gold, meaning we'll see the return of Hinata Dawn Crowned, Greasefang Okiba Boss, and Lightpaw's Emperor's Voice. Please cast your vote in the community tab, link in the description, and let me know in the comments who you voted for and which commander from Neon Dynasty you'd like to see in a future poll. Before we close out, again, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel cannot grow without your support. And if you feel like showing your thanks by keeping me caffeinated while I make these videos, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank Snatchy for their generous donation. Thanks for the coffee, Snatchy, and thanks for supporting the channel. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.